On mounting a rising ground, which brought the figure of his fellow traveler in relief against the sky, gigantic in height and muffled in a cloak, Ichabod was horror-struck on perceiving that he was headless.
The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving is a classic tale known throughout the world. We all know it, we've all heard some variation, and anyone who lives in the Hudson Valley is all too familiar with it. Being a local myself, I know firsthand how famous the legend is. The town of Sleepy Hollow becomes one huge Halloween party in October. The streets are lined with orange and black lights, witches, scarecrows, and all-around fun for tourists to seek. We live for the story, but it's interesting to me that a lot of people have not read the story itself or are not familiar with the author. You may have heard Washington Irving's name before, but never really put much thought into him. He's the guy who wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle. And honestly, I don't blame you if you don't know more. He wasn't exactly a huge feature of our education. You probably didn't even read his work in school. Well, I'm a bit of a literature nerd, so here I am, knocking on your door, spreading the good word. He's one of the most famous American authors of all time, being the first to make a living out of writing. He's the man who gave inspiration and encouragement to Nathaniel Hawthorne and Herman Melville, who I'm sure you know much more about. Irving himself is a legend, one that now rests in beautiful Tarrytown, New York. So, I wanted to tell you all about the legend of Sleepy Hollow. But I think it's important that you have some initial background on the author himself, and understand why and how his story came to fruition and became the legend it is today. The origins of the Headless Horseman and Sleepy Hollow are as incredible as the story itself. Welcome to Hudson Valley Legends. Washington Irving was born in New York City in 1873. The child of Scottish-English immigrants, he was named after General George Washington. He was born the same week that the American Revolution ceased, so his mother decided what better name for her son other than after the great George Washington himself. There is a story of when Irving was 6 years old. He met George Washington and was blessed by him. The impact of that meeting between him and the general was so profound that he actually painted a scene of it, a beautiful watercolor piece that still hangs in his house-turned-museum. Irving became fascinated with the Hudson Valley and would commonly travel from New York City to the lush countryside to admire and revel in the scenery. He also enjoyed hearing tall tales, legends, and lore told by strangers he'd meet along the way. He was fascinated by German and Dutch tales, and you can see it in his stories. One day, while in England, Washington Irving was terribly homesick for the Hudson Valley and began to weave together not only the tales he had heard through his travels, but the setting and imagery of his favorite place to be. Thus, a legend was born. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow is technically a short story, but impressive in length, clocking in at over 85 pages long. If you've never read it, I highly recommend you download a copy or pick it up at the library. It's a classic, and an excellent one at that. And if you're a local, you might take a lot of pleasure in recognizing the sites and locations that Irving describes. Because it's so long, I unfortunately cannot give you the entire plot, but I'll do my best to be brief. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow is a story told through the fictional narrator, Deirdre Knickerbocker. Well, sort of. See, this one old guy once told our narrator this story, so it might be a bit of a tall tale. Where the old guy heard it? That's never stated. Confused yet? Well, you should be, because I'm going to make a point about this later. Our narrator, who now we know may not be the most reliable source, tells us about a schoolmaster named Ichabod Crane, a a slender, beak-nosed, nerdy fellow who lives in a part of Tarrytown called Sleepy Hollow. He's a well-respected man in town, and naturally his eye takes to the beautiful young Katrina Van Tassel. She's a child of wealth, so Ichabod not only falls for her beauty, but her status and prominence. The problem is, there's another man in town who has his eye on her, Brom Bones, and his jealousy boils when he sees that Katrina is starting to fancy Ichabod herself. So, Brom does what any reasonable adult would do in this situation, begins to play pranks on Ichabod and torture him. Ichabod remains resilient, and it proves worthy. He winds up being sent an invitation to a harvest party at the Van Tassel home. Thinking that this will be the turnaround in his relationship with the lovely Katrina, he attends. Unfortunately, Katrina turns him down. Heartbroken, he sets off into the woods and goes for a ride on his horse, Gunpowder. It's worth mentioning here that Sleepy Hollow is a town that heavily believes in ghost stories and legends, and although Ichabod is from Connecticut, he absorbs and loves ghost stories as much as the townsfolk. One story in particular stands out, however, the legend of the Headless Horseman, the mounted, decapitated ghost of a fallen Hessian soldier. So, as he rides through the woods, he starts to hear and see strange things around him, and eventually meets the feared Headless Horseman himself, on a huge black steed, looming before him amongst the dark trees. Ichabod takes off wildly into the woods, and an epic chase begins, the horseman on his heels. Once Ichabod sees freedom, a bridge to get him out of the woods, the horseman throws his head at Ichabod, who falls off Gunpowder and tumbles to the ground. The next day, a search party attempts to find Ichabod. However, there's nothing found in the woods other than a splattered pumpkin right at the spot where Crane was attacked by the horseman. So, there you have it. A rundown, admittedly very loose, of the legend of Sleepy Hollow and our world-famous Headless Horseman. I left out much of the story that, again, I think it's important that you read it if you're interested in the subject. So, with the little I gave you, what happened here? What was that ending about? Why did Ichabod disappear? What's with the pumpkin? Is the Headless Horseman real? And of all things, why is he a Hessian soldier? To start to understand the horseman himself, we need to understand the history of the area at the time. After the American War of Independence exploded in the North, the city of Boston was quickly surrounded by American revolutionaries. Seeing their position as dire, the British evacuated the city on March 17, 1776, and sailed to Nova Scotia to plan a new invasion. General Washington and the Continentals knew the British would return soon, and Washington recognized the strategic importance of the Hudson River and the Hudson Valley as well. The British realized that if they could control the Hudson, they could effectively split the northern colonies in half, separating Boston and New York from other important cities to the revolutionary cause, like Philadelphia. In August of the same year, General Howe returned with a large British invasion force, which included a large group of Hessian troops. Hessians were Prussian mercenaries recruited by the British after they failed to recruit enough numbers of regular troops. This combination of soldiers made up the British invasion force. Though the British quickly did take New York, they were unable to encircle the Continentals, and Washington's army escaped New York intact, moving north through Westchester. Over the course of the next few months, the British would chase the Continental Army north through the Hudson Valley, making the Royals pay for every mile they took, including a valiant defense at the Battle of White Plains. Washington eventually crossed his army across the Hudson at Peekskill, and the British returned to New York, seeing that they had missed their opportunity to encircle and crush Washington and his Continentals. In Irving's story, the galloping Hessian is said to have lost his head in some, quote, nameless battle of the Revolution. But this isn't pure fiction. Major General William Heath of the Continental Army, who published his memoirs after the war, kept a journal of experiences during the Revolution. On November 1st, 1776, Heath wrote in his journal that, quote, "A shot from the American cannon at this place, White Plains, took off the head of a Hessian artilleryman," unquote. So it's believed that Irving, a man who loved a good battle story, heard or read about this and was inspired by the journal entry. So we know why he's a Hessian, and now we know the lore of the soldier getting his head shot off with a cannon. Well, why a pumpkin at the end then? If you read the story, you can safely assume that the Headless Horseman is indeed Brom Bones playing yet another prank on Ichabod, because whenever the story of Crane is mentioned in town, he scoffs and laughs to himself about it, especially the pumpkin part. So, Brom is a jerk and threw a pumpkin at Ichabod. The imagery of the exploding pumpkin may have its roots in a battlefield artillery practice. See, American soldiers during the Revolution would heat up cannonballs, firing them up until they were glowing a bright orange, and then shoot them at the enemy. The now unstable metal ball would explode into orange bits when it made contact. Now, you can see the connection of the imagery, right? This isn't necessarily why Irving picked a pumpkin, but it's certainly interesting to think about. I'm of the opinion that the legend of Sleepy Hollow did just that, build a legend. It's a cleverly built story and structure. Instead of as a passive reader, you think of yourself sitting by this narrator, Deirdre Knickerbocker, telling you the story he heard from some old guy. We're playing a game of telephone here, right? You have an unreliable narrator giving you a loose, second-hand story about something that may or may not have happened. This is the original, fictionalized urban legend. And this fiction story was so popular and so strong that we now have people who genuinely believe the Headless Horseman can be seen riding through Sleepy Hollow Cemetery at night. It's brilliant how well Irving weaves his fictional story through his tall tale-loving narrator Deirdre. But now you have to wonder, how did Irving himself come up with such an idea for a character? I had the privilege of sitting down and talking to Jonathan Kruk, author of The Legends and Lore of Sleepy Hollow, an amazing book that, admittedly, much of my research came from. Jonathan is the guy when it comes to the short story. Not only did he author an excellent book on the subject, he lives the legend of Sleepy Hollow every year. He's a master storyteller who does dramatic performances of the legend. His show is held within the Old Dutch Church, that is, the one from the story itself. So, if there's anyone to talk to about all things Headless Horseman, it's Jonathan.
The Headless Horseman, of course, is the iconic ghost, this strange figure who does come up in other forms and other cultures. Washington Irving, however, created this mysterious entity. We don't know whether it's Brom Bones in a disguise, or is there really something out there, this force, this inexorable being that is on an endless quest to find its head. So we're left wondering, oh my God, is he going to take mine? Is he going to come by? And that just compels people to be interested. Coupling that with the first real nerd, Ichabod Crane, and you add to the mix a wonderful coquette, this flirtatious young Katrina Van Tassel, and it's the magic mix of characters moving us to stay interested.
What fascinated me the most about the Headless Horseman, though, is why the hell does he throw, of all things, his head at Ichabod? What is the symbolism behind that? And why is he at such unrest? Jonathan's interpretation is one of my absolute favorites.
Washington Irving says that during a nameless battle in the American Revolution, a cannonball carried away the head of a Hessian trooper, who then forever haunts the region searching for his missing head. Because he's headless and a Hessian, he probably didn't get a marker or got a wooden marker, and so he's kind of cursed in a way. And not having a head, he's a restless spirit. And the spirit fears perhaps going to the grave, going to the next life without a head. So incomplete, it goes out searching and, unto this day has not found it. So there's the smoking cannon. I mean, there's primary source that a Hessian lost his head at the Battle of White Plains, and that's the fact to the heart of it. But then the soul, the embodiment, becomes Washington Irving, collecting and collating Dutch traditions, Dutch stories, the German lore, the bit of Robbie Burns, his own experience with the different characters here in the Hudson Valley. And he weaves this story that continues to inspire today. I mean, we've got, I've counted 8 different movies. We've got the Sleepy Hollow series, haunted hayrides, many places with that name. And everywhere you go, when I go to, even in, Europe and China, they know of the Headless Horseman. He's like our version of Dracula and Frankenstein.
I love that thought, that our famous Headless Horseman is our Dracula or Frankenstein. He's this icon, a figure you can recognize around the world, and it all stems from Washington Irving's homesickness for the lovely Hudson Valley. There's something so charming, so remarkable in that. And I delight in the fact that this story itself is the original urban legend. Jonathan explains.
Of course, Washington Irving wrote it, but he credits Geoffrey Crayon, a sketchbook, a crayon, and then he says it's Dietrich Knickerbocker who, well, he doesn't exactly say it's Dietrich Knickerbocker. He says the story was told to him by a shabby gentleman who kind of is like Dietrich Knickerbocker. And the story, it's at the very end, it's like there's this old gent who's telling a kind of council of wise New York City, almost like selectmen, almost like elected officials, and they're listening to this guy. And he tells the whole story, and at the very end, he takes a glass of wine and drinks it and says, faith, sir, I don't believe the half of it myself, and, has a slurp of wine there, and they're like, what? And then you're left wondering, where did this story come from? So Irving's got all these layers, and you have to kind of open them up like a present until you get to and that's what a legend is. You open it up and you get to the truth.
I want to thank Jonathan Kruk for not only taking the time to speak with us, but for his amazing work in keeping the legend of Sleepy Hollow as relevant as it was hundreds of years ago. You can find him at www.jonathankruk.com. That's Kruk. You can find his book, his CDs, and a calendar of all his events. Also, if you're interested in seeing him perform, which you totally should be after this, you can see him at the Old Dutch Church in Tarrytown on the weekends in October. But be sure to get tickets as soon as possible because his show sells out very quickly. I also want to thank you, the listeners. There is a new page on the website called Friends of HV Legends, which you should visit because not only does it feature some of the great folks who have supported me along the way, but also some businesses who would like to return the love. Featured are the Hudson Valley Mobile Spa and Walkway Wools. Both are offering a 15% discount to any listeners of the show, so be sure to check it out. Local business is what keeps our community thriving, so please be sure to support our neighbors and shop local when you can. It makes much more of a difference than you think. Written and narrated by Tony Odell. Co-written and produced by Michael McDermott. Intro clip from The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, performed by Jonathan Kruk for Burger Platters Productions.